Hello everyone and welcome to this new series I'm doing called Matt has run out of original ideas to do in Kerbal Space Program, so let's just turn to making tutorials instead. One of my favourite types of missions to do in KSP, when I'm just playing for fun, is to do Apollo style Mun missions, and a lot of people in my comment section say they can't rendezvous or they can't go to the Mun. So here we go, let's do a tutorial on how to send an Apollo style mission to the Mun. Hey, how's that for user interaction? Yeah, for those of you that don't know, Apollo-style Mun missions are missions done in the style of NASA's Apollo missions, which on reflection, it's a fairly self-explanatory title, isn't it? Anyway, and so our journey begins, as these journeys often do, in the vehicle assembly building. We're going to take this lander can here, and then we're going to go and grab ourselves this fuel tank here. It is overkill for what we need it for, but we're going to use it for now just for an aesthetic point of view. It looks pretty good on this setup. And then we're going to add this engine here. We don't need the Poodle engine because we don't need one that powerful basically, and this one's more efficient. Then we're going to add a decoupler and fuel tank underneath it, so we have this sort of setup here. We're then going to right click and hit auto strut on the fuel tanks just to stop this thing from wobbling itself to pieces. Our next order of business is just to try and tidy this thing up, make it look a little bit more aesthetically pleasing. So we're going to take those structural panels there, hit X a bunch of times to get lots of symmetry on them so we can sort of make a little shroud for the engine. We could use a fairing piece, but I quite like this method because it means we can radially attach a science tuning unit and then using the rotation and offset tools make it nice and clipped into the side so we have some science gear, and on the other side of course we can attach our mystery goo thermometer and our other science pieces of science kit. I didn't really think this sentence through before I just said it. One thing we can do is just add some ladders as well. You don't need ladders for Mun landers because the Kerbal EVA packs work, but just in case you run out of monopropellant fuel or whatever, it's good to just have the backup of having ladders just in case. And I guess if we really don't want to go from like a realistic standpoint, the Apollo landers had ladders too. You can see I just extended them just to make sure they are the right length to reach the floor. Next thing we're going to do is add our monopropellant tanks and solar panels. We don't need extra monopropellant tanks, but just for the sake of this being a tutorial, you guys might not be as efficient at docking as I am, so we're going to have the extra monopropellant to have just as a sort of safety net. And this thing is coming together beautifully. So we can add some monopropellant thrusters there, the RCS thrusters. And you can see we just added those landing legs there. I like to extend them just to make sure that the engine isn't touching the ground and the landing legs actually provide ample clearance for the craft. And then finally we can add a docking port, just a standard size, and then just add any of the command pods, doesn't really matter which one, and set that as the root part by clicking that root part button there. And this will allow you to just click the docking port and drag the entire thing over as a sub-assembly. You click the sub-assembly button on the bottom left and save it as whatever you want. Why not save it as Apollo Lander? Seems like a good name, doesn't it? And then we're going to build the rest of the Apollo rockets. We're going to add a command pod here, which I'm pretty sure is actually based on the Apollo module. Well, I say that, but there's DLC coming out soon which actually does have an Apollo capsule, so I have no idea what this one is supposed to be now. But either way, we're going to save it as Apollo, add a docking port to the top so this thing can dock with the lander. You could add a launch escape system if you cared about Kerbal lives, but I don't, so we're not going to bother with that. Then we're going to add a heat shield and a decoupler. This is actually a poor choice for decoupler. The blue ones are overkill, they're heavier. The purpose of the blue ones is to separate both modules and leave neither of them with a decoupler attached to them. But the one you're supposed to use in air quotes, the black and yellow one, is very ugly. The blue one's much better looking, so I just use that one anyway. So as I'm sure I don't need to explain to you, we just added that fuel tank there and a Poodle engine, and then we can just attach our lander directly to that Poodle engine. And don't worry, you can use the docking ports as separators, so we can just directly attach the docking port to that Poodle engine. You may have noticed as well I disabled the shroud on the Poodle, again just to facilitate ease of use when we're actually doing this mission. And you can see they've actually drained that top fuel tank in the lander because we don't actually need that entire fuel tank to get back into Mun Orbit. Mun Orbit, you only need 580 meters per second of delta V. I can explain delta V as we go along if you're not sure what it is. But to put it even simpler, we just didn't need that much fuel, but the next size down, as in like the lower diameter fuel tank, that wouldn't have been enough fuel. So this is kind of a happy medium, and it looks aesthetically nicer than having kind of a skinnier fuel tank, even if it means that when it's full, it's overkill. So you saw me just sort of faffing around with the staging, making sure all the engines fired in the correct order, but it's not a huge thing because you can just right click them as you go along, and I ended up doing that anyway during this flight, but that's what you just saw me doing there. And then we can add the final touches to our command module. So we can add some solar panels, some batteries, monopropellant tanks, and RCS thrusters. We don't actually need this much monopropellant and RCS thrusters on like the lander and the, command pod. when I play the game, I don't really bother using monopropellant for docking anymore, but again, this is for a tutorial, so I'm kind of over-engineering things to make it a little bit easier for you, the player. But how's this for a beautiful cinematic angle as we pan around, taking a look, getting a good look at this craft. Some of you might have noticed that I haven't actually added the parachutes to the command module yet, but don't worry, we can do that now. I'm ashamed to admit how many times I've actually forgotten to add parachutes to landers. In fact, I did an Apollo style mission on this channel once, and we just completely forgot to add parachutes, and I had to send a separate mission up to go and like attach a module to the front of the ship before we could deorbit it, because I forgot parachutes. But don't worry, I remembered at the last moment in this video. Yeah, you probably just saw me quickly add a decoupler and a fairing piece to the bottom there, so we can start building out the rocket itself. So in order to keep this kind of true to Apollo, we're going to have 3 sort of rocket stage, if that makes sense. We have a stage designed to circularize and get us en route to the Mun, and then we kind of have 2 stages for the actual Kerbin ascent. I mean, in KSP you don't need this many stages for this sort of mission, but if we're going to be trying to be kind of true to the Apollo style, then we may as well, you know, remain true to the Apollo style. And then once the rocket's done, we can go back up to the fairing and just build it out. And like I say, you can close this around a launch escape system if you want to, but I never saw the point of launch escape systems in this game because you can just revert the flight. I mean, I guess if you're playing Iron Man mode with no reverting, then it's a useful thing. But if you're having to watch this tutorial, you're probably not playing Iron Man mode. So yeah, other than that, it's gone now, but I just clicked auto strut on the remaining fuel tanks just to keep this thing wobble free as we fly it. Speaking of flying it, okay, so I'm like including this, even though it's quite basic at this point, I'm including it in the tutorial just in case some of you still don't know how to get into orbit or are struggling. What I like to do is just as soon as I pretty much left the ground, I start to sort of tap the D button. You can see on the nav ball there with SAS, isn't it? By the way, you need to enable SAS just in case. You need to know that by hitting T. Throttle up to full, then hit space to obviously activate the main engine. I just tap D. Every time you see the SAS sort of symbol flash, that's me tapping D quickly. And this just lets us tip over nice and gradually. You want to basically tipped over to 45 degrees by the time you reach 10 kilometers. And you want to kind of do this as sort of one smooth motion. You want your arc to be fairly consistent in how it curves, if that makes sense. Then we're going to open map view and just keep a look at the time to apoapsis. I mean, I don't technically need to open map view because you can see our time to apoapsis on those Kerbal engineer readouts, which I've left installed just to help you follow along. I recommend installing that mod, by the way. I don't know why it's not part of the game at this point. Anyway, as I'm sure you've probably figured out from watching the video, we have detached our first stage and are firing up the second stage, which is a Rhino engine, which is more efficient, but it's not very well suited to lower atmospheric flight, which is why it's used for upper stages rather than lower stages. But as you can see here, I've started now flattening out our flight plan to basically follow the prograde marker. Once your time to apoapsis is sort of between 50 seconds and a minute-ish, that's when I like to start gradually tipping it over to follow along the prograde marker. Just because then we're contributing more of our energy towards sort of increasing our horizontal speed. And there we go, we've emptied up that fuel tank there and we are on an orbital trajectory. We're not going to be getting in orbit obviously at this point, but we're going to be getting into space at least. We're going to use a little bit of fuel just to raise our apoapsis to about 100 kilometers, just because it's a nice round number, and then we'll do a burn at apoapsis to get our orbit circularized and stable. And we can plan out this burn by making a maneuver node by just clicking that point on our orbit, creating a maneuver node, and dragging out the prograde vector until our apoapsis and periapsis on the maneuver node ring are, at an equal level more or less. Now I have talked about this before, but just for the sake of completeness in this tutorial, in order to work out when to start burning, you take your estimated burn time, cut it in half, and when your time to maneuver node is the same as this value, that's when you start burning. For example, if you have a 10-second burn, you want to start burning about 5 seconds before your maneuver node. Now what you saw me do just there was create a custom quick save, which if you're sort of new to this game, I recommend very highly. You just hit Alt F5 and that just lets you have more than one quick save, and obviously hit Alt F9 to choose from your list of quick saves. But there we are in orbit, so that brings us on to the next part of this guide. So what we're going to go ahead and do is open up map view by pressing M, clicking on the Mun and setting it as our target. And then we're going to add a maneuver node by just clicking on anywhere on our orbital line, dragging out the prograde marker to raise our potential apoapsis to where the Mun, the same height as the Mun basically, just dragging it around until you have an encounter there. Don't worry too much about the inclination just yet. We're just going to get our encounter set up and then we'll do a correction burn sort of midway to the Mun. So we're just going to sort of drag out on the prograde and retrograde markers. You can scroll, so just sort of hover the mouse over the marker and scroll up or down to do more fine-tuning movements, which I find especially helpful when you're doing sort of more complex missions. It's not so warranted for Mun because it's fairly basic in terms of how complicated Kerbal missions can be, but I don't know, I'm just used to doing it at this point. And then it goes without saying that once you've made your maneuver node, you can time warp to that node and then throttle up. So in order to try and keep this true to the Apollo missions, we're going to be using this Rhino stage to get ourselves on an encounter with the Mun to the point where we're actually going to be colliding with the Mun's surface, and that's the point at which we're going to ditch this stage just so we're not leaving any debris in space. So yeah, did overcook that burn a little bit, but it doesn't matter too much. We've got enough fuel to compensate. And now we're going to do the sort of classic Apollo reconfiguration thing. So yes, the Apollo rocket didn't just sort of launch as one big monolithic thing that was all in the correct orientation. The lander is obviously in the wrong place that we need it for right now. So once you've got your Mun encounter, you can detach the command module. And I don't use RCS at this point. I would just sort of get yourself a little bit, like activate the Poodle engine, thrust a little bit to get yourself clear so that when you spin around, you don't end up whacking into the lander. Double click the docking port there to set it as your target, then just point towards the target using the nav ball marker. Thrust a little bit, try and keep your speed below 0.5 meters per second and you should be fine. Just because when you use the RCS, sometimes it messes up your horizontal orientation, things like that, whereas if you're just using the engine, like prograde and retrograde, you should automatically end up on the correct sort of pointing straight towards the docking port, and it should make the docking a doddle. And with that, we can focus ourselves on getting a good Mun encounter. So just for the sake of this tutorial, to make life easy for yourself, we're going to fix our orientation so that we're on an equatorial orbit. Obviously, this isn't necessary if you have experience doing this or you want to be landing at a specific location on the Mun, but just because I'm guessing most of you probably haven't done this very often, or at least would like to get better, so I recommend not making things too difficult for yourself and just making sure you're getting on an equatorial Mun orbit. And you want to make sure that as you pass by the Mun, you're going along with its rotation. So just take a look at the map view. Use time warp, makes it a little bit easier. Just make sure that your kind of orbital line that you'll be following kind of goes along the same direction as the Mun. I hope that makes sense. Anyway, you can see I made a maneuver node there using the normal and anti-normal nodes to fix our orientation. You can use a little bit of prograde and retrograde as well. As long as your periapsis is above sort of 10 kilometers from the Mun's surface, you should be fine. Just making sure you're clear of all the I was about to say landmarks, then was going to say mountains and end up nearly saying lanterns, so just thought I would share that little fact with you all right now. But yes, I guess what I'm doing on screen needs no real explanation. I'm just creating a maneuver node, dragging on the retrograde marker in order to ensure we get into a roughly circular Mun orbit. I wouldn't kick yourself about getting an exactly circular orbit. As long as it's kind of a rough circle, you're absolutely fine. Getting into the orbit around the Mun is very, very easy, particularly with this ship we've got here. It's very over-engineered for what it really needs to do. Even though we drained the fuel tank for the ascent stage, we still got more than enough fuel for what we really needed to do. But look at me getting ahead of myself here talking about our lunar ascent when we've not even circularized. And now we've circularized. Just continue burning, gradually burning. I feel like I should have something to talk about here, but I don't really know what I could talk about. And there we go, we've circularized, so it doesn't matter anyway. Thank you, phone. You could have waited like 2 more seconds because I'm about to go into the next transition anyway. So now we get to the classic KSP tutorial of, landing on the Mun, which has probably been done to death, but I feel like in the context of that I'm, kind of showing an entire mission in the style of Apollo, I'm, at least to a certain extent, differentiating myself from the masses. So to begin, we're going to point ourselves retrograde on the nav ball and just basically focus on killing off all of our horizontal speed first. As in, we're going to follow the retrograde marker at first and deploy the landing gear by pressing G, but then we're going to just continue burning sort of on the horizontal plane just to kill off as much sort of horizontal speed as possible just to make landing a little bit easier. There's not a lot I can really say other than just say to watch the footage because I feel like that gives you a better indication of what I'm doing than what my words can do. But yes, the retrograde marker is your key to success, and of course by success I mean not crashing into the surface and subjecting your hapless Kerbals to a horrific and fiery death. Well, I say fiery, but there's no oxygen on the Mun, but you get the sentiment. Now, I should clarify that this is not how I land on the Mun at, well, for want of a better summation here, at my level. By that I mean that this is an easy way to learn the basics of landing on celestial bodies and to get practiced at landing on the Mun, but it is by no means the most efficient way of executing a Mun landing, but it's pretty easy and accessible, and so for the sake of this tutorial I feel like it's the most appropriate method. Of course, the absolutely most efficient course is to do what's called a suicide burn, in that you begin your burn at a point where you decelerate to 0 meters per second and touch down at the same time on the surface in one constant burn, if that makes sense. But that's very hard to do, and it's nigh on impossible to do without mods unless you have a lot of perseverance and patience with the quick save function. So the method I'm showing in this tutorial is basically just trying to bleed up as much horizontal speed, well, a significant chunk of horizontal speed, and then focusing on just pointing retrograde and sort of tweaking kind of the amount of thrust you're providing using shift and control on the keyboard to sort of touch down at a fairly slow speed. So once I'm quite close to the surface I decelerate to about 10 meters per second, and then when I'm very, very close I slow down to sort of less than 1 meter per second for the actual touchdown. The landing legs we're using on this craft can tolerate a slightly harder landing, but just for the sake of sort of realism and, you know, I guess mission satisfaction, I like to touch down as slow as I possibly can. And thus we begin the historic moment of deploying the ladders. Not getting Jeb on EVA yet, as I thought we would be doing just here, but rather running some science experiments, which is also important. It's not actually important, actually, in this save, because we're on a sandbox save mode, but regardless, if you're playing this on science mode, we could get some science from this mission. But there he is, Jebediah Kerman, going out onto the surface, one small waddle for a Kerbal, one giant stumble for Kerbal kind. I didn't think this quote through, and I really should have for such a historic moment such as this. But there we go. So Jeb has planted his flag and blah blah blah, and he can just go and collect his science from all the science experiments units by basically using his RCS pack, hovering up, and you just kind of sort of tactfully right click the science experiments in order to extract the science, and then we can put them back on the command module and prepare to launch back into Mun Orbit. So like this is the part of the mission which is like by far the most intimidating to inexperienced players, I think. At least it was the part I found most difficult when I was first starting out. But what I just showed you there, if you want to do this, you can pump any surplus fuel in that lower stage into the upper stage, because remember when we drained some of that fuel? If you want to have a little bit more to play around with to give you the biggest safety net you possibly can, then you can if you want. But for the sake of this tutorial, I'm not going to bother. I mean, I did a bit just to show you could, but we won't be using any of that fuel for this part of the mission. So what we're going to do is we're going to time warp till the mothership is nearly overhead, but not quite. This wasn't actually the most optimal place for it to have been in, but for the sake of the tutorial, it's kind of nice to have a little bit rough around the edges. So to do a kind of launch like this, where it's all very dramatic in one go, you want to shut down the lower engine and make sure that the decoupler and the upstage engine are in the same stage, and then you just throttle up, hit space, and it just launches you nicely. And then once you've kind of ascended a bit so that you're clear of any mountains or edges of craters, you can pretty much start flying flat straight away. You can use the map view or with Kerbal Engineer just by hovering the mouse over the apoapsis marker. I'm not doing it here for some reason, because that would have been a nice thing to showcase, wouldn't it? But you can just make sure that your time to apoapsis isn't kind of falling too fast. So our time to apoapsis at the moment is over 1 minute, so it's fairly easy. We've got a pretty good thrust weight ratio on this capsule. But yeah, there's not a lot for me to really talk about other than just keep an eye on the map view, and you can see how I'm pointing prograde more or less, but sort of moving the nav ball left and right using A and D on the keyboard, just to make sure that our orbital line is kind of becoming within line with the mothership's orbit. I wouldn't worry too much about whether or not it's anti-normal or normal, just hit left and right. If you hit left and it makes things even more eccentric and worse, then go a little bit more to the right. It's just a case of steering it, really. It gets easier the more you do it. The best place to practice this is probably Minmus. I did make a tutorial about this a while ago, in 2016, so over a year ago, kind of outlining a Minmus style Apollo mission and how it's kind of one of the best ways to get better at Rendezvous. But once you've kind of done Minmus, or you just want to throw yourself into the deep end, then you can try this on Mun. So let's talk about what's on the screen. You can see those two orange markers, and occasionally you can see the pink ones as well. But just using the orange ones as an example, those are our two closest approaches to the target. So the marker ahead is where the target will be. The one behind, we're talking about the orange ones here, is where we will be. So we kind of have two locations. So I'm going to create a Mun Orbit node apoapsis, and you can see kind of the first encounter, the orange nodes, we're a little bit behind the target. So what we're going to do, we're going to get ourselves into an orbit that actually has a periapsis lower than that of the mothership, so that we'll end up having a shorter route around the Mun, and that will allow us to catch up. So by the time we get to encounter number 2, the pink markers, we'll be pretty damn close. You can see there, 0.7 kilometers, 0.6 kilometers. I find the easiest way is to just play around with retrograde and prograde to get the closest approach you can, then kind of use normal and anti-null to make sure your inclination is as close as it can be, because more often than not, any separation is caused by an inclination difference. And then after that, then using the blue radial in, radial out markers to get your approach nice and close. And if you're finding it really hard to do and it's taking a lot of burns to get close, or you're not really getting close, I'll probably just revert the quick save and launch again and see if you can get a closer encounter, because it's not hard to do once you've done it, but it might take a few attempts to kind of get into the rhythm of it. So I would just probably keep practicing it till you can get fairly close. Like, I wasn't that close. I would normally aim for a little bit closer if I was kind of trying to do this for a video to look all like elite and all that, but I wasn't, so I didn't. So we can just I was about to say teleport. I guess we are. It's kind of no, it's not. It's not teleporting at all. So anyway, once we're getting near the target, so I kind of went with 0.6 kilometers, which is pretty close for the Mun. You could go closer. I've done it, so I've kind of got a maneuver that gets me to encounter of 0 kilometers from the target, or like 0.1. But really, for practical purposes, half a kilometer is absolutely fine. Just point retrograde. So make sure your nav ball, you see now my nav ball says target above it. If that doesn't say target for you, it might say surface or orbital. Just keep clicking surface or orbital until it says target, and then point yourself retrograde, and that will be pointing retrograde to the target, so that when you burn retrograde, you're bleeding off speed relative to the target, so you end up matching orbits with it and, like, you know, matching speed with it. And then you can see I kind of alternate between burning retrograde, then pointing towards the target using the nav ball. I'm on sandbox mode, so my pilots are able to do that automatically, but you can do it manually if you wanted to, but just for the sake of trying to keep this tutorial nice and concise, we can just do it automatically. And then we burn it, keeping our speed fairly low, and then just burning retrograde again, bleeding off our speed. And yeah, so I could do this using no monopropellant, and I'm not going to use too much to kind of show you that you don't really need to use monopropellant, but it does make things easier, and it'd be nice to kind of show you how to do docking with monopropellant in this tutorial as well, since that's kind of technically part of it. So we're going to do the docking itself with the Apollo command module, and I like to get my sort of position to be as close as possible and kind of as like, you know, aligned as possible without monopropellant, just using SAS. And then set your camera to chase, and you can see that as we rotate the craft, kind of the camera moves with it. It makes it far easier to work out kind of which direction the monopropellant thrusters are going to work. So when you press down, the ship actually thrusts down. Now there are two ways of doing this. You can use the docking mode, which means that WASD kind of do directions rather than, you know, rotate the ship. So A moves the ship left, D moves the ship right, etc. But I find it's easy just to leave it on default and use, so imagine like the layout of WASD. It's that, but I, J, K and L on the keyboard. So I would kind of point the ship down, K would move the ship up, etc. And H and N are what moves the ship forwards and backwards rather than, you know, shift and control. And other than that, like you just saw me do, I feel like the footage spoke for me. Just keeping your speed nice and low, taking your time, making sure the docking ports are nice and aligned. Feel free to move the camera around just so you know that you're pointing in the right place. A lot of people advocate raster prop monitor and docking port alignment mod to help with this. I've never used them, so I can't really speak, but I'm told that it makes it much easier. So that might be something you want to look into if you're still struggling. So before we ditch the lander, it's important we take the experiments from it. I mean, like I said earlier, we're playing on sandbox, so it doesn't really make a difference. But for the sake of this tutorial, the fact you might be doing this in a science safe. Also, don't forget to deactivate the lander's engine. We can just quickly do a deorbit maneuver and put this thing on a collision course and then boost ourselves back up, just to make sure we don't leave the lander stuck in orbit. But anyway, before I kind of interrupted myself, just go on EVA, right click the lander, take experiments, and then just store them in the Apollo command pod, just so we don't lose any of our data. But now all that's out of the way, we can pretty much get to the final part of this mission.
Nobody likes me, everybody hates me, they want me to go eat some worms.
So now we've got ourselves into a circular Mun orbit. We just need to create a maneuver node to get back to the surface of Kerbin, which is probably the easiest part of the mission. But for those of you who don't know, we basically want to be burning kind of backwards along the Mun's orbit, so then when we exit the Mun's sphere of influence, we'll be on a lower orbit than the Mun. If we burned kind of so that yellow dotted line was going forwards, as in sort of with the Mun's direction around Kerbin, we'd end up in a higher orbit, which is not what we want. I mean, it's not the end of the world, because it doesn't take that much more fuel to kind of decircularize from that height, but deorbit from that height. Why did I say decircularize? I mean, I guess it is kind of synonymous, but it's kind of a weird choice of words. Anyway, I'm getting off topic here. So we can actually, as you can see, get our periapsis to be within Kerbin's atmosphere directly from the Mun without having to do a secondary burn when we're around Kerbin. So I hope you kind of understood what you were supposed to do just from watching. Look at that. Beautiful Kerbin rise, by the way. Hope you kind of understood what to do just from watching that. Create a maneuver node that's sort of around the other side of the Mun from where you want to be exiting from. Does that make sense? I hope that made sense. Just dragging out the prograde marker to raise your apoapsis. Okay, you guys definitely get this. Okay, I don't need to detail it so thoroughly. But when you're at your maneuver node, just throttle up, I guess. If you want to make things faster, I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but I get a lot of people ask me, a surprising number of people ask me, so I'm guessing it's not hugely well known. I mean, I think it's well known, but I guess there is always a percentage of the player base that doesn't know. You can time warp through burns or when you're very close to the surface of celestial bodies by holding down Alt and then pressing the time warp button. So obviously time warp is initiated by pressing the full stop or period button for my American viewers, or the comma to kind of slow down time acceleration. You can hold down Alt and time accelerate through burns and things as well, but you are limited to ×4, which is fine for most people. Moho missions can be pretty painful doing this way, or ion engines or ghillie missions as well. So you can get the mod better time warp so that you kind of have even faster time warp rates through physics, although that can be sometimes a little bit glitchy, which is why the stock game doesn't do it. And then when we're ready to detach our lower stage, if you want to do this like air quotes properly, kind of point normally, as in sort of to the pink triangles, so normal or anti-normal. That just ensures that your stage doesn't fall directly below you and you won't end up crashing into any exploding debris. Not that I don't think it really matters in this game, because I always, in videos I generally detach directly retrograde just because it looks cooler from a video standpoint. But I guess if you want to do this kind of sensibly, you would detach it normally and anti-normally. Now this is the one part of the mission where we didn't do things particularly faithful to Apollo, because we're not going to be landing in the sea. But I don't really mind. I think it's fine. We did have 3 parachutes though, so that's pretty neat, don't you think? But no, that pretty much wraps the video up, to be honest. I hope you enjoyed. Do you guys want more tutorials? I feel like I quite like giving them, but I also am worried that it is kind of seen as this, oh, you're just kind of milking. I don't know why. Maybe I'm just more cynical than most, but if people want more tutorials, I can totally do them. You'll have to let me know in the comments what you feel is lacking in the world of tutorials, because I feel like most subjects are covered by other people. But I don't know, if there's anything that you feel is lacking, or you want something like you want me to cover it, then by all means do let me know in the comments, and I do read comments. People think that I don't read comments for some reason, but I do. I read all the comments. So yeah, I don't always read ones that are flagged as spam, because most are just spammy, and YouTube has this thing where sometimes it thinks you're a spam commenter, even though some of them, I've looked through them, they're not spam at all. So if I don't react to your comment or like reply, it might be because it was flagged as spam for some reason. But we are getting a little bit off topic somewhat, but there we go, touchdown. So once you've done that, make sure you recover the module. Obviously I don't know why you would forget to do that, but just in case. And then on screen we have some more things, namely the tutorials playlist. I've got a playlist of all the tutorials I've done. I've also got a playlist of Blunderbird's missions, because they're kind of like soft tutorials, I guess, so they're kind of the same sort of subject. Bottom left is just my most recent upload, and bottom right was specially selected by YouTube's algorithm just for you. So other than that, Patreon, Discord, Twitter are all in the description, and have a good day. And Christmas! It's good Christmas soon.